Good evening. Hello and welcome to the Miami Herald's Innocence Lost Town Hall meeting. I'm Alex Villock, President and Publisher of the Miami Herald Media Company, and we're so glad that you could join us for this discussion about this important issue and the ways that we can affect positive changes to Florida's child welfare system. I would first like to say, welcome to our community room. When we moved here to Doral, one of the things that we set out to do was design a room where we could invite you, the members of our community, to engage with us on critical issues of importance to our community. And we are glad to host you here this evening. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to take a moment first to recognize a few people for joining us tonight. Miami-Dade Public School Superintendent Alberto Carvalho, Circuit Judge Rosa Figueroa, the Mayor of Pinecrest, Cindy Lerner, and also as part of today's panel, Senator Eleanor Sobel, and Miami State Representative Eric Friesen. Your participation in this town hall meeting is greatly appreciated, and we thank you for being here and taking the time out of your day. As a new president and publisher, I'd like to say how proud I am of our newsroom for the immense undertaking in producing the Innocence Lost project and report. I'm looking forward to many future reports like this one that we will produce and work in conjunction with our community to make an impact and difference. The Innocence Lost investigation is an example of what we do best, shining a light on serious problems in government and our society and being instrumental in creating a dialogue that makes a difference. We've had already a tremendous response to this series, and we're already seeing changes with plenty of funding discussions taking place in Tallahassee. But there's still much work to be done, and that's why we are here tonight. We take our role as a community watchdog very, very seriously, and we work hard to honor the trust that you, our readers, place in us, and we wouldn't be able to do it without you. So again, thank you for coming out this evening, and I'm going to turn it over to Miami Herald Executive Editor, Mindy Marquez. Mindy?
Thank you, and thank you all for braving rain and Doral traffic to be here with us today. Like Alex said, this is the first of what we hope are going to be many town meetings in this space. And you know, one of the key roles that a media organization plays traditionally is that, yes, we do shine a light, but we're also the conveners of community conversations. We like to, you know, not just spotlight the problem, but help guide the conversation about what's the solution moving forward. And the long tradition is that, you know, we had letters to the editors, you know, we have the commenting on our websites, you know, there's Twitter, Facebook, but we still like the good old-fashioned face-to-face communication, and we hope that this is going to really be a great dialogue on a really important topic. In a lot of ways, I would say that this story really has been in the making for a decade. Carol Marvin Miller, as many of you know, if you read the Miami Herald closely, has really been a champion of not just children, but the elderly. Really, she's been a champion of the abused, the neglected, the often forgotten. And as we all know in this room, DCF does a fabulous job most of the time protecting the children who really are the victims of what should be their fiercest and most loyal supporters, their very own parents and caretakers. And that's the biggest failure right there. And then there's supposed to be a safety net. And most often, that safety net works, but sometimes it doesn't. And what their reporting showed is that over the last 6 years, 477 children died as a result. And we've seen terrible stories in the past, and when there's a particularly horrible case that makes us want to cry, then the panel's convened, and recommendations are made, and somehow nothing happens. And with this project, we really wanted to pull it all together to show the scope and also to be able to really make it so that we can no longer ignore this. And I think that it's a testament to everyone who's agreed to participate with us here today, and for those of you sitting where you're sitting, that this is an issue that I think is going to find a solution. And that's our hope for tonight, to convene, to find common ground for solutions moving forward. As they say, it takes a village, and I just want to make 2 acknowledgments. Number one, I'd like to acknowledge my colleague, Miriam Marquez, executive editor of El Nuevo Herald, who ran the series in our Spanish sister paper, and I think that's an important audience that we reached on top of. So thank you, Miriam, for that. And I'd also like to acknowledge the collaboration with WLRN. Not only are they our news partners, but they are co-hosts of today's session, and we really value their partnership on this. So with that, I'd like to introduce Terrence Shepard, who's our news director at WLRN. Terrence?
Thank you, Mindy. Thank you very much. It's our pleasure to collaborate with the Herald on this project. WLRN and the Miami Herald formed a collaboration in 2003 called WLRN Miami Herald News. It's been going strong ever since. As the NPR affiliate in South Florida, we specialize in audio storytelling. And we worked along with Carol Marvin Miller and Audra Birch to produce an overview piece of Innocence Lost to help the radio audience understand what was going on and to direct them to the Herald series. WLRN also emphasizes community engagement, bringing your audience into the news gathering process. The production of this town hall, in fact, benefited from over 100 comments we received from many of you here through our Public Insight Network. And Public Insight Network is also a collaboration between us and the Miami Herald. Steph Farrell is the Public Insight Network analyst, and she has been reaching out to you individually through emails to join the network and continue the conversation with Innocence Lost, as well as other important issues for our community. Now I have a couple of housekeeping matters. At this time, we'd like you to put your cell phones on silence. Please put them on silence so that other guests can hear panelists. From the audience, how do you work these mics? Second thing is, if you have questions, fill them out on the question card and make sure you put your seat number and the color of your top. So if you got a question, just hold your hand in the air and wave, and we will come and get it from you. There are snacks in the corner. Need a little nibble or some drink. There are restrooms out the double doors and to the right. Now I'd like to introduce the host of tonight's event. Tom Hudson is Vice President of News for WLRN, and he will start by providing an outline of tonight's program. Tom?
Thank you very much, Terrence. To this town hall, thank you for discussing this important and wildly important issue for all of us here in this community and in this state. I want to thank the Miami Herald for being such a great news partner of WLRN for the better part of a decade, and that partnership is strong and continuing here tonight. We will be streaming this event live online. We are asking you to put those mobile devices on vibrate, not to turn them off, because we are encouraging you to share with social media what you're hearing tonight and what you're thinking about tonight. Share that on Twitter at Miami Herald or at WLRN. Use the hashtag InnocenceLost. Feel free to share that. It is streaming, by the way, at miamiherald.com/live. We're also recording the audio for this event. It will be on the radio, on WLRN radio, Monday morning at 9 a.m. and again at 7 p.m. We feel that the reach of this town hall is significant. The importance of this topic is so great that we want to be able to share the conversation with the regulators, with the policymakers, and with the community leaders, with our entire South Florida audience on WLRN. We have lots of experts in the room tonight, lots of stories in the room tonight, certainly. Those question and comment cards that Terrence mentioned will be wildly important to hear from you throughout this evening's conversation. Fill out that form. When you do have a conversation piece that you'd like to mention, a question, raise your hand. We will have folks around collecting those. And as the topics come up, if you are asked to ask your question, a producer will come and grab you and bring you to the front of the room where a microphone will be for you to ask your question. The questions, by the way, will not be taken in order as they're collected. If the conversation moves on, for instance, to another topic, we may not get to the question. I'll apologize in advance. We never get to all the questions like we'd like to get to. Unfortunately, time is a rare commodity and of which we have very little. We also are recording the video of this program, not only streaming it live, as I mentioned, but recording this video, which will be produced and also will appear on the Miami Herald website. So, with that, let's begin the conversation for Innocence Lost. What does it mean to be a 6-year-old in Florida? Think about that. Probably finishing up your kindergarten year in school. You may have t-ball practice or soccer practice. Probably just learning how to read, learning how to swim, playing games, growing up. This was not the life of Joshua Jenkins. He showed up in school with cuts, bruises, and broken bones. Every injury had an explanation for teachers and DCF investigators. In 2006, when Joshua was asked about his injuries, he told authorities, "Daddy did it." Teachers told investigators that Joshua didn't want to go home after school like all his classmates. He seemed frightened of Daddy and Mom. The DCF closed its subsequent investigation, finding no suspected abuse of any kind. 2 years later, in 2008, Joshua died from blunt force trauma. His stepfather is serving 30 years for aggravated manslaughter. Joshua is just one of the stories of the 477 Florida children who had contact with the Department of Children and Families who died of abuse or neglect since 2008. Detailed extensively in the Miami Herald Innocence Lost investigation. We'll hear from the agency tonight. We'll hear from lawmakers tonight. We'll hear from community organizations in this town hall. But first, we want to hear from the two reporters who led the Herald's investigation, Carol Marvin Miller and Audra Birch. Carol, Joshua's story, like the 477 stories, all tragic, all with their own awful circumstances. But was there a systemic breakdown?
I think when we interviewed Secretary Jacobo at DCF a couple of months ago, she acknowledged that the facts of this case were not appropriate, that they were not defensible, and I don't think there's anyone here in the room who would seek to defend what happened to that little boy. But we also found that it was illustrative of a much broader problem within Florida, and that is that we shifted policy towards something called family preservation, where a premium is placed on keeping families together to the extent that you can, because as we know, foster care is not the best place to grow up, and of course, nobody in child welfare, no one who works within social services wants to flood any state with foster children. What Florida did wrong, and again, Secretary Jacobo acknowledged this, was that we shifted toward this policy very rigorously before ensuring that we had adequate services in place to mitigate the risk that such children as Joshua faced. And by that I mean, if you are going to leave an infant or a toddler with a mother who has been a drug addict for 10 years and is still actively using dangerous drugs such as painkillers or methamphetamines, you would want to ensure that that mother is actively engaged in drug treatment, is seeking recovery, is succeeding in recovery, and not relapsing as soon as you close the case. And we weren't doing that. We were closing cases. We were leaving children like Joshua in harm's way. And what we found is implementing this policy in that fashion turned out to be very dangerous for Florida children, especially the youngest among them, infants and toddlers who were not capable of speaking out in their own defense, who couldn't ask for help, who couldn't run away. Those children died at a far greater rate than their older siblings.
And in fact, Audra, most of the kids in the cases that you detail were younger than 3 years old.
The overwhelming majority of the children that we wrote about were under 5 years old. And what we've learned is that they simply don't have, as Carol suggested, the ability to defend themselves. We had children like Kyla Joy Hall was 8 months old when she died. She was beaten to death by her father, who's now serving a life term. You had Emmanuel Lewis, who was thrown out of a moving car, and he was also an infant. These are clearly people who are children who are not able to get the help that they need. The other thing we found, there were a number of trends that started to emerge as we studied these cases. Another one is that 2/3 of those cases were linked to drug and alcohol abuse. And what we know is that a home in which you have parents who are either abusing drugs or alcohol and not receiving the appropriate treatment is a home that has risk. And so we saw that over and over again. And we even had cases where the child would actually die of the very drug that the parent was abusing. Oxycodone, for instance, was one of the big ones that came up over and over again, particularly during the time where prescription pill abuse was, sort of run amok in the state. The other thing that we found was that the safety promises, the safety promises that were used to try to try to stabilize these homes were not effective because you didn't have, in too many of the cases, meaningful follow-up. So it's not enough to ask a parent to not do something or to be a better parent if you don't have the people and the resources in place to be able to monitor it and to make sure that whatever it is that we're asking you to do is getting done. And if that's not the case, then DCF has the power to compel the parent to order services.
And we'll talk about the philosophy, we'll talk about the policy, and of course the practice with the agency. Carol, first though, how did you come up with 477? What was the criteria that you used that came up and resulted in that number?
We sought to review every child death beginning in January of 2008 in which family members had some sort of history with the Department of Children and Families. That history had to be within 5 years of the child's death, and it had to involve either a sibling, the child herself or himself, or a parent in such a way that the agency was aware that the parent, who was an alleged victim at the time, had a child or was about to have a child. If the child herself or her siblings were never on DCF's radar screen, we excluded it from our sample. There were quite a few challenges in terms of figuring out which cases were relevant to our study. I don't think 477 is a magic number. It's just the number that we came up with in the time frame we had. As you know, unfortunately, children die in Florida quite regularly, and if the pattern holds, there will be 2 deaths this week, or 1. It's just the way things have been.
Audra, the criteria you used, where did that come from?
We use the criteria of both DCF, which, how they determine family history, but then we also use the federal regulation, which is the 5-year window that they use to measure deaths.
Pete Degree is the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Children and Families. Welcome, Pete. Thank you for coming to the Town Hall. Grania O'Sullivan is the Director of Children's Legal Services for the agency as well. Thank you for your time. Pete, were these deaths preventable?
Many of them were, just as simple as that. And I think there's been several problems, some of which we think we've come away in solving. and some of them are still not totally solved.
I'm going to interrupt you for one moment and ask you to pull the microphone a little bit closer so that everybody in the back of the room can hear you as well. Thank you.
Sure. I think first and foremost, this is a terrific series, and frankly, in reading it very carefully, I don't find an awful lot to debate with the Miami Herald.
Were you shocked by the results?
No, not at all, because we've done similar studies. We had the analytic group SAS come in and do a very, very comprehensive review, and frankly, their data ties just about perfectly to the Herald's data. And what's so striking to me is what I really love about this series is I'm the guy who reviews these cases. And what you've done is you put names and faces out to the public so the public can understand what a serious and devastating problem this is. And I'm really hopeful that this will lead to very, very concrete action this year. I mean, as I look at it, I see several things. I see a little bit less of the trying to keep families intact because safety has always been the priority. I've never heard anybody say that safety is a secondary priority to family preservation. However, what I have seen as an awful lot of is child protective investigators and case managers with too much work to do. Right now, today in Miami, the average CPI has 18 cases. But guess what? A whole bunch of them are new. So some of the new ones have 2, and some of the old timers have 30. And those 30s are families, and they probably have about 60 kids. So we've got people in this town tonight that are trying to keep up with the well-being of 60 children. It is humanly impossible. So the single most important thing that can be done is to adopt the governor's recommendations, which gets our child protective investigators on the whole to a caseload of 10 families, which is still too high. I'm telling you, in Los Angeles it's 7.5, in New York it's 5.
What kind of budget would it take to get to that kind of caseload here in the state of Florida?
The governor has proposed a $40 million effort to build CPIs. And he's doing 2 really powerful things. Number one, for all cases, get to a 10-to-1 standard. And for those little kids, one of the great things about the SAS study, and it ties perfectly to all the Herald's data, is the SAS study indicates, really nails down very carefully, when you talk about a kid who's under 4, in particular where there's drugs, where there's violence, and particularly where there's physical abuse. And what was so shocking to me is when there's a sexual abuse involved in the family, the odds of death go up by 67 times. I mean, absolutely incredible. And so this really targets, out of those 270,000 kids we investigate every year, it gives us a population of 20,000. And our secretary, Jacobo, really had a brilliant inspiration in terms of pairing up CPIs like law enforcement does, working as a team on that particular population of those 20,000 kids to zero in on them and keep them safe. And practically that entire group of 477 is that population of kids. So that's what the governor's initiative is about. There's other things like additional quality assurance staff, but that's sort of the heart of it.
I do want to get back to the proposals that are on the table and your reaction, Pete and Grania, your reaction to those. But I want to take a step back to the findings from the Herald investigation, what Carol and Audra detailed, the 477 verified deaths of abuse and neglect. You say you weren't surprised or shocked by that matched what you had a third party see. What kind of internal accounting is done when it comes to child deaths at DCF?
Well, it goes through a process both internally, where we have a death review of coordinators. I personally look at each and every one of them in some detail. And it also goes to an interagency team in each of the circuits and eventually up to the state death review team.
Is there the kind of accounting, however, that the Herald did in terms of the gathering together of the cases so you can see a whole picture as opposed to 477 individual tragedies?
No, absolutely. I mean, that's what I'm talking about with the SAS study, and we had the Casey Foundation do the same thing. And the conclusions, the Herald's conclusions, the Casey conclusions, and our own conclusions are all pretty similar and have led to a whole bunch of things. Probably first and foremost is we worked with our federal National Resource Center for Child Protection and with the Children's Research Center and built a methodology. Frankly, our staff were running on a methodology that was developed in the late 80s. with very little change, although, over those 25 years or so. So we built this new methodology, and we built it right into our computers so we can track every action and are busy rolling it out. Probably the most important part of this is we now have the safety plan nailed down, hardwired in our computer system, and the safety plan is required to be stated in verifiable terms. It requires a monitoring protocol, and you've got to go back and keep verifying it to making sure it's working. And the single most important thing, and this comes up in case after case after case, you can't walk away based on a bunch of family promises. Two things. Number one, if the child is in danger and you've got the safety plan, CPI, you cannot close that case. You've got to give that case to CBC Case Management, and they've got to take ownership. Somebody is going to own that case until the child is not in danger. Case closed, no exceptions. Number two, we worked with our substance abuse system, and now we built right into the computer, hardwired it, where the substance abuse providers have to, we have an alert system, and if somebody drops out of treatment, they just check a little box, and it immediately sends notification to either the CPI or the case manager that we've got a person failed. Just in the month of March, I was just looking at this data, we got 832 alerts that people had either dropped out or were failing placement. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is we had about 2,500 alerts that people were doing pretty well. So and it's not a hopeless situation. Maybe about 50–60% of people really do become clean and sober. But building that stuff into the very infrastructure and training people to use it correctly is sort of the heart of what's necessary.
Grania, let me ask you about the teeth that you and your lawyers have when it comes to court and this family preservation philosophy. Number one, does that philosophy still persist today?
No, absolutely not. The paramount thing here is that the child's safe, and whatever that's going to take. We at legal have to work with our PIs really to develop the evidence and help them to gather the evidence so that we can bring petitions to court. It's very difficult oftentimes to develop that evidence because, and one of the reasons I do appreciate Carol bringing this to our attention in the sense of bringing it to the community's attention, because oftentimes in legal it's very difficult to get the friends, the neighbors, the people in the community that may know about what's going on but are afraid to speak up. And for us at legal, those are our eyes and our ears. Those become our critical witnesses that we're able to bring forward in these cases. So I'm really hopeful today that getting this out to the community, that people are not so afraid to do that so that we can help in developing these cases and developing them into court.
Would you like to see more teeth in the safety plans in court?
Oh, I
court-ordered
agree.
safety plans, and what would it take for your team of attorneys to be able to adjudicate that if that was the case from the legislature?
Well, I agree 100% with the safety plans and what Carol was saying about them, and Pete. We cannot rely on parental promises. These parents are the very ones that are creating these issues, and to rely on them to say, I promise that I'm not going to use drugs, or I promise that I'm not going to go back to the person that's been my abuser, it just doesn't make any practical kind of common sense. So we want to see these safety plans that are verifiable and that we can follow up, and that there's people in the community, whether it's the neighbors, the grandparents, other people that can verify those safety plans for us. So when, as Pete was saying, when they're not following through with those services, when they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, we're immediately alerted, and then we can take that and use that information as the imminence we need to get back into court to say that there's an issue and that we need to be able to bring it to the court's attention.
Why were they relied on, though? What was the guiding philosophy of those plans that has failed?
Well, I think Pete can take that question.
I think, it's back to what I'm saying. There was a methodology created in the late 80s, and it really hadn't changed until just recently. It just did not have the strength to bear up to things like the prescription drug abuse. There were like 170 pill mills in Pinellas County and Hillsborough County. It just was incapable of it wasn't sophisticated enough to really get below the surface. It was just, the system just demanded a new approach and a new safety methodology. Simple as that.
Pete, you mentioned the governor's increased budget proposal for the next budget cycle of $40 million, $39 million is being debated in the House and Senate, obviously, in terms of specifics. There's also been talk of upwards of 400 investigators. If that 40 million and 400 investigators, that's an annual salary of $10,000. What kind of resources would a $40 million bump in the agency budget mean for the agency?
Well, it's a huge deal. I mean, as I said, it really does two things. It takes our current trend lines and it brings our CPIs to not having more than 10 families at any given time. That is still, as I said, a big amount of work. That's at least 20 children they're responsible for, but it's a lot better than it is today.
How many caseworkers is that new?
Well, I'll tell you exactly. It's for getting to 10 to 1, it's 164 new CPIs. For doing the pairing up with the kids under 4 with the drugs, violence, physical abuse, the population we're talking about here, it's 193. And then 59 supervisors. Supervisors are very pivotal in this methodology because they are actively involved with their staff in consulting with them every step of the way. And then we've developed our genius, regional director in Tampa, Mike Carroll, came up with something called real-time quality assurance. We call it the rapid safety feedback. But what it is our quality assurance people, we just pulled them off of looking at old cases, and they look at cases in process now. And what this does, it would allow us once again, with that 0 through 3 population we're talking about, to fully look at, with a quality assurance expert, at 25% of them constantly. That's additional 26 quality assurance people. So those are the key things. There's a few administrative and support people and things like that, but that's the heart of it.
Audra?
The package that the governor has put forth is for $39 million, and $8 million of that would go towards the sheriff's offices. But what it does not appear to address at this point is services. What we know, and what we've been told in all of these studies, is that we have a gap in services. There's been an analysis done, and I don't know that it's been completed, but thus far we have not seen any of the proposals come forth that are ascribing a significant amount of money to the very social services that are needed to mitigate the risk and stabilize the homes.
Carol, I'm wondering your thoughts as someone who has lived with these 477 cases over the past several years as you've investigated them. The financial prescription that we've heard put forth responds and accomplishes what in your mind?
I think the 400 boots on the ground, as the governor has referred to them, will go a long way. Assistant Secretary Degree is 100% correct. If you are juggling a caseload in which you are responsible for the safety of 30, 40, 60 children, you cannot succeed. You will have too many balls in the air, and unfortunately, sooner or later, one of those balls is going to drop to the floor. But I also agree with Audra. There are other sides to the equation, and the other side is that once your investigator has determined that a child is at risk, you have to do something to stabilize the situation of that child. And to do that, you have to refer the case to a case manager at a community-based care agency. And unless you just want to go through the motions, you have to provide services and supervision. And that is the side of the equation that the current legislation does not address. Number one, Mr. Kelly is here, and he will tell you that his groups, he represents the community-based care agencies, they need additional caseworkers to bring their caseloads down because they have the same challenges as the investigators. They've got to go monthly and look at these families and eyeball these children, and they are responsible for ensuring these kids are safe once the case has been transferred to them. But there are also services that have to be brought to bear. Drug treatment for parents with addictions, mental health care for parents with chronic and severe mental illnesses such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which are by definition a risk to children. Domestic violence shelters that help women make the changes in their behavior that enable them to no longer be at risk by continually going back to men who abuse them and also abuse their children. Those services must be restored, and I say restored because over the years, since the Great Recession, they've all been declining. And what we've done in the past several years that we know doesn't work is to say we will leave these children with parents on their promise to improve their behavior, but with no meaningful services to protect the children. And I think everyone in this room now agrees that that doesn't work.
Finally, as we wrap up this portion of the town hall, Grania, I would like to ask both you and Pete. Tonight, are Florida kids in those vulnerable, troubled homes safer?
I think they absolutely are. I think bringing this to the attention of the community, this article has done a world of good for what we're doing internally within the department. And I know specifically, as I've come on as the new statewide director at CLS, something that I instituted and Pete referred to, the Casey national study that was completed, the national organization that completed the study on the child deaths. And what they said was finding that an overwhelming majority of these children, up to 90% of them that were under 4, with multiple priors, mental health, substance abuse, domestic violence, those are 90% of these children. So we can identify that population. We've taken steps within CLS. When we are staffing these cases, I've implemented a protocol so that if you are staffing one of these cases and it meets the Casey criteria, then that is going to be escalated. Whether or not on the other side the protective investigator wants to escalate or not, it will be escalated within CLS. So a higher level of management beyond a line attorney and a supervising attorney up to a managing attorney will review that staffing. So if we're saying that we can't go forward, we better make sure that we're making the right decision. And that will be more eyes on those cases internally at CLS.
Pete, as Deputy Secretary of DCF, your message to the community about whether or not children tonight are safer in troubled homes in Florida.
I have no doubt that they're safer because of the improvements in the safety plan, the bringing substance abuse into the computer system with the alerts, with rolling out the safety methodology, and with other improvements. I'm seeing good results of this. And that's also documented in the SAS study. We still have a horrendously high level of deaths of kids where there's been some involvement. However, it's been steadily decreasing since it sort of peaked in about 2009, 2010, and has been going down a little bit. Nowhere near what it should be, but a little bit.
Carol, respond to that.
I feel like I have to, and Secretary DeGree and I go back a long way, and I respect you immensely, but I don't respect your data on this point because there are several things that we know. We know, number one, that the agency has been chronically and routinely undercounting the deaths, and that occurs for a variety of reasons, one of which is that a case can remain pending for many months, indeed for years. As you know, if you read our series, Nubia Barahona never counted. As far as the state of Florida statewide Child Abuse Death Review Committee is concerned, Nubia Barahona was never killed as a result of abuse or neglect. And she is not anywhere near the only case that has remained pending so long that it never counted. But there are other things that are going on that we would suggest also render the data unreliable. And one of the things that happened was around 2010, a very deliberate decision was made to tweak the definition of what it is to die from neglect in Florida. Two of the largest categories of child abuse or neglect-related deaths are drownings and what are called co-sleepings, in which a parent places a child in an adult bed or in a crib under conditions which are unsafe, and the child unfortunately perishes. More often than not, but not always, the parent has a drug problem. Most people who roll over on their baby in bed are going to feel it, but You're not going to feel it if you just took 2 oxycodones and a couple of Xanaxes. And what Florida did around 2010 was change the definition of a neglect death such that if you did not deliberately intend to willfully neglect your child, it doesn't count. So if I go home tonight, take a bunch of drugs, put my kid in bed with me, knowing that it's unsafe, roll over on her and kill her, it won't count.
Deputy Secretary, respond to the change in definition of neglect death
Yeah.
and the delay in classifying some clearly commonsensical causes of death being abuse and the impact on the data that you're citing.
Yeah, I'd just like to offer anybody who would like a copy of that SAS study. This isn't our data, it's what SAS put together, and their sources are the Department of Health and first calls to the hotline, nothing to do with our decision making. I mean, that's where it comes from. And frankly, this is a national trend where that also, and not just a Florida trend. So please, anybody who would like that, I would be glad to email them a copy. What we did is we got explicit that if parents, in fact, are using drugs or in any way negligent, it is in fact something that we verify. So actually, as a percentage of reported deaths, the numbers that we verified actually went up. And, after the allegation matrix was redefined, we verify a higher percentage of the reported deaths than we did previously. And frankly, it's all in the SAS study, and I'd be glad to share the specifics with anybody.
We have to leave this part of the conversation right here. We do want to thank Pete Degree, Deputy Secretary of the Department of Children and Families in the state of Florida, and Grania O'Sullivan, Director of Children's Legal Services for the Department of Children and Families in Florida. Thank you, both of you, for your response here tonight. Next up, that Herald investigation, of course, hits just as lawmakers meet for the 2014 session. In our next segment, what can be done to the state's children protective laws and policies. We'll have more as our town hall continues in a moment. Thank you again.